Good day everyone, my name is Bea Silabor and today I'm going to discuss the classical conditioning of Ivan Pavlov. So Ivan Pavlov is a Russian physiologist and he discovered the classical conditioning and also known as the Pavlovian conditioning. And during 1980s, he did a lot of research around the digestive process of dog, and that's the time when he discovered accidentally the classical conditioning. Whereas Pavlov demonstrated the stimulus and response bound, which some considered as the building blocks of learning are formed. So classical conditioning, it is a learning process that occurs through associations between an environmental stimulus and a naturally occurring stimulus. So in simple terms, two stimuli are linked together to produce a new learned response in a person or animals. So classical conditioning, it is an ability of conditioning someone or something in the way we want them to behave. It also had a major influences on behavioralism that is based on the assumptions that learning occur to associations in our environment. And also classical conditioning emphasizes the importance of learning in our environment because our behavior is affected through our interactions in our environment. So before we proceed, let's know first some terminologies Pavlov uses in his experiment. So first, we have the stimulus. It is a thing or event that produces a reaction. Next, we have the response. So it is the reaction or interpretations. And the unconditioned response, it is the unlearned response. So now let's move on to the classical conditioning. So the components of classical conditioning. It is very important for us to understand and know these components of classical conditioning so that we can understand how the classical conditioning of Pavlov works. So first, we have the unconditioned stimulus or the UCS. So a stimulus that naturally and automatically triggers a response. And we have the unconditioned response or the UCR. It is the unlearned response that occurs naturally in response to the unconditioned stimulus. Next, we have the neutral stimulus or the INS. It is an object that did not produce a reaction. Next, we have the conditioned stimulus or the CS. It is a previously neutral stimulus that when paired with an unconditioned stimulus triggers a conditioned response. Last, we have the conditioned response or the CR. So it is the learned response to the previously neutral stimulus. Now let's move on to the stages on how Pavlov classical conditioning works. So the stage 1, before the conditioning, in this stage, the unconditioned stimulus or the UCS produces unconditioned response or the UCR in an organism. So don't worry guys, I will just show you the example later on how this classical conditioning of Pavlov works. So the stage 2, during the conditioning. So during this stage, a stimulus which produces no response or the neutral stimulus is associated with the unconditioned stimulus, at which point is now became known as the conditioned stimulus. So during the stage 3 after the conditioning, so now the conditioned stimulus or the CS has been associated with the unconditioned stimulus, which is the UCS, to create a new conditioned response or the CR. So here's the example on how the classical conditioning of Pavlov works. So first on the stage 1, so before the conditioning, so Pavlov uses the meat or the food as the unconditioned stimulus. And the moment Pavlov presented the food or the unconditioned stimulus to the dog, so the unlearned response of the dog to the food when he sees the food is through salivation. So when Pavlov presented the food, the dog will automatically salivate to the presence of the food. Now, but when we use the neutral stimulus or when Pavlov uses the neutral stimulus, so he uses the bell, and the moment he presented the bell to the dog did not produce any responses. So that dog is not responding to the sound of the bell. So whereas our neutral stimulus, as I've mentioned earlier, our neutral stimulus, it is an object that did not produce any response. So that's why when Pavlov used the bell to the dog did not respond. But during the stage 2, during the conditioning, so our neutral stimulus, which is the bell, plus our unconditioned stimulus, which is the meat or the food, is triggers the conditioned response of the dog. So when Pavlov paired the neutral stimulus to the unconditioned stimulus, the dog will salivate, so the dog will respond to it. And now let's move on to the stage 3. So after the conditioning, so during this stage, the previously neutral stimulus triggers the conditioned response. So every time the dog hears the sound of the bell, the dog will salivate because that is unlearned response to the sound of the bell, because according to the dog, or for the dog, the sound of the bell, it is the cue for his food, or it is now for his meal. So that is the classical conditioning of Pavlov work. So again, if we presented the unconditioned stimulus or the meat, the dog will salivate. But when we present the neutral stimulus, which is the bell, the dog will not respond. But during stage 2, when we paired or associated our neutral stimulus to our unconditioned stimulus, which is the bell plus our meat, is the dog will salivate. But during the stage 3, in here, we only uses the bell. So when you uses the bell to the dog will respond to it. So that's the classical conditioning of Pavlov. So take note that classical conditioning, it is a learning by conditioning. So a learning occur through associations, through association. So, and through classical conditioning, we can also replace the bad habit of students into a good habits. And also through classical conditioning, mental diseases can and mental diseases like fear and phobia can be removed through classical conditioning. So that's how important the uses of classical conditioning in treating the mental diseases like phobia. And also we can use this inside the classroom, in learning inside the classroom. So now let's proceed to the another lesson, or the next lesson, which is the SR learning theory by Edward Thorndike. So, Edward Thorndike is famous in psychology for his work on learning theory that led to the development of operant conditioning within behavioralism. So, Thorndike ideas paved the way to the Skinner's operant conditioning theory, because the Skinner's operant conditioning theory is also based on the theory of Thorndike, which is the law of effect. So, specifically the law of the laws of learning, specifically the law of effect, whereas it stated that any behavior that is followed by pleasant or unfavorable consequences is likely to be repeated, but any behavior that is followed by unpleasant or unfavorable consequences is likely to be stopped. So, in short, it is all about the reward and punishment that will affect the behavior of students, as mentioned to the theory of Skinner, which is the operant conditioning theory. So the SR learning theory represents the stimulus response. SR framework of behavioral psychology, whereas learning is the result of associations forming between stimuli and responses. So SR learning theory, take note that our stimulus plus our response equals to learning. So again, our stimulus plus the response equals to learning. So whatever is stimulated, whatever the stimulus in the child's environment, whatever the changes in the child's environment, when a child or a person respond to it, so that is equal to learning, that is equated to learning. And this theory also emphasizes the importance of reward or incentives to stimulate and influence what and how pupils do things, including how they learn. So, in his theory, he emphasizes the importance of reward and incentives. So, it is mentioned also in the laws of learning, especially the law of effect, whereas if the effect is good, the students will redo the action, the students will do it several times because of the reward they will get in exchange of doing such action. So the effect will be strengthened and became habitual. But take note that if the effect is not good, if the effect is bad, so the student will avoid doing such action. The students will stop doing such action because they are afraid of the punishment or the humiliations of the teacher inside the classroom. So that is why he emphasizes the importance of reward and incentives in his theory, because the rewards also help the students to be motivated in learning inside the classroom, not only inside the classroom but also in their environment. So now let's move on to the laws of learning. So first law is the law of effect. So law of effect, responses to a situation which are followed by a rewarding state of affairs will be strengthened and become habitual responses to that situation. So just like what I mentioned earlier about the law of effect. So the law, if the effect is good, if the effect is favorable to the students, so the students will redo the action, the students will do it again, the students will do it several times for the sake of the rewards, because through doing that action again and again, they will get the reward. So the response will be strengthened and became habitual because they will get a reward or incentives in exchange of their action. But if the effect is not good, so the students will stop doing that action. The students will avoid doing such action because again they will be afraid of the humiliation inside the classroom. So just like for example, if the teacher will get mad every time the students will recite or participate during the class and they recite the wrong answer, the students will be afraid of humiliations, or afraid of the punishment of the teacher because they recite the wrong answer. So the students will avoid doing that action. So the student will not participate every time you are teaching them because they are, or they experience the punishment. And if the effect is good, so just like for example, every time the students will recite, every time the students will participate, and then you give the reward, they give them extra points, you give them the incentive, so the students will redo the action. So the students will be motivated to recite again, the students will do it again and again because in exchange of their participation they can get the rewards, they can get the points they wanted in the classroom. So that's how the law of effect affect the behavior of students or affect the learning of students. So next law is the law of exercise. So connections became strengthened with practice and weakened when practice is discontinued. So because practice makes perfect. Again, practice makes perfect. So the more you practice it, the more you do it, the more you practice, the more you will become. So that is why it will weaken if we will stop practicing or we will stop doing that action, and it will be strengthened, it will do it again, so it will be practice. So just like for example in doing the mathematics problem, so if we stop solving in and the one question that is so hard to solve, so if we will stop solving because we cannot get the right answer, so our learning will stop, so we will back to zero. But if we practice again and again, if we practice more solving the mathematics problem, so it will be strengthened, so we'll be a great mathematician in the future because we did not stop practicing or solving the problem. So that's the law of exercise. And the law of exercise, so it take notes that law of exercise, it will be weakened when we stop practicing, but it will be strengthened if we'll practice it. So last, or the next law, is the law of readiness. So law of readiness, a series of responses can be chained together to satisfy some goal which will result in annoyance if lacked. So in law of readiness, so here it says here that the students will learn if they are ready to that learning. So even though you will do everything, even though as a teacher, even though you do everything to teach the students, to teach the children, if they are not ready for learning, the students will not learn. You cannot make them learn. You cannot make your students learn because they are not ready, or they are not yet ready physically, mentally, and emotionally to learn. So just like for example, if you will be teaching the grade 1 students a algebra, statistics, or the logarithm, so the students even though you will do everything to teach them that mathematic problem, the students will not learn because their development or mental development is not yet developed. They are not yet ready for the to handle that situation, to handle that problem. That is why readiness to learn is very important. For you to be a effective teacher, you need to inline or interconnect you or correlate your teaching to the development of the child, to the capacity of a child. So next, let's proceed to the example of Thorndike experiment on the cat. So just like Pavlov, Thorndike also studied the learning. So usually he uses the cat as the experimental object. So he devised a classical experiment in which he used a puzzle box to empirically test the laws of learning. So he placed a cat in the puzzle box, which was encouraged to escape to reach a scruff of fish placed outside. So just look at the picture and I will just explain to you later on why it is happening. So Thorndike would put a cat into the box and time how long it took to escape. So the cat finds different way to escape the puzzle box and reach the fish. So eventually they would stumble upon the lever which opened the cage. So when it has escaped, it has put it again, and once more time it took to escape was noted. So in successful trial, cat would learn that pressing would have favorable consequences. So that is what I mentioned, the law of learning, the law of effect. So and they would adapt this behavior, becoming increasingly quick at pressing the lever. So in short, when Thorndike put the cat in the puzzle box, so in the first time the cat will try to find a way to escape from the box and escape from the box to get the fish outside the box as a reward. So when Thorndike put again the cat inside the box, so the cat learned to adapt in the environment of the puzzle box. So the cat learned to open the lever so that he can go out to the box and get his reward, which is the fish. So in this matter, it will become habitual to the cat. So every time, because for the cat, every time he goes or he escapes from the box, he will get the reward. So that is what Edward Thorndike implying in his law of learning. If the effect is good, if the effect is followed by the favorable consequences or the rewarding state or the incentive state, so it will become habitual, the effect will be strengthened and it will become habitual. But if they experience the unfavorable consequences, if they experience the punishment, so they will stop doing such action, they will avoid doing such action. So that's how the SR or the stimulus response learning of Thorndike works. And it is very important for a future teacher educator to understand this as our learning theory, so that they can motivate the students to learn by just giving some rewards or incentives inside the classroom. So that's all about my reports. Thank you and God bless everyone.